Hello and welcome to this edition of the Wise Medical Minute. I had an inquiry recently to talk about sugar cravings. This was in response to a video we did recently that I'd encourage you to check out in terms of tips for successful weight loss. People wanted a little more of an explanation for why sugar is a problem when you're trying to just be healthy, even if weight loss is not one of your objectives, or in the situation of people trying to lose weight, it's a frequent unnecessary source of calories. Now the truth is, when we ingest sugar, it does release various hormones or endorphins or neurotransmitters really that make us feel good, make us feel relaxed. It's a calming effect, especially when we're under stress, and I'm going to get back to that a little bit in a minute. But sugar is a source of essentially a natural high. Now, you can't have a healthy diet with no sugar in it. Some carbohydrate is very important. I read from multiple sources that the average American consumes about 22 teaspoons full of sugar every day. So think about it a minute. It doesn't take a lot to get up to 22 teaspoons of sugar. 2 or 3 teaspoons, 2 or 3 cups of coffee, and you're more than halfway there, depending on how big your teaspoons are. But for a healthy diet, and the reference I'm going to use is the American Heart Association's recommendations. There are some others that were a little more liberal. But 6 teaspoons per day is enough for men. That's my first cup of coffee every day. But for women, they say the equivalent of 9 teaspoons per day. So if you're consuming more sugar than that, even if you're not doing anything to try to lose weight, or if there's no issue with diabetes, if you're consuming more sugar than that, you're probably consuming unhealthy amounts. Now, ways to deal with the cravings. We frequently will resort to things like a candy bar when we want a snack, or we're feeling down, want to give ourselves an emotional lift. But one suggestion to deal with that particular type of impulse is to combine foods. In other words, something healthy with something that might be enough to address the sugar craving, but in smaller amounts that it's not so unhealthy. And the example I'll use is dipping a banana in chocolate. Okay, now, if you're not trying to lose weight, similarly, dipping an ice cream cone in chocolate is better than having a whole chocolate ice cream cone or a sundae. But again, the issue is portion control, and I won't belabor that point except to say that you have to choose the healthy whatever you use to put the chocolate in. Now, I came up with a couple of examples. I mentioned the bananas, but oatmeal and chocolate chips is a nice healthy combination that provides not only the impulsive sugar craving satisfaction, but a little bit of fiber, and it gives you a fullness and has some positive effects on things like your cholesterol. So for some people, that's an option, and instead of some of the things people do for a typical breakfast. Now, for folks who are not on a caloric restricted regimen, in other words, if you're at or near your body weight that you want to keep, if you've already reached the maintenance phase in one of our weight loss programs, then another option will be something like almonds mixed with things like chocolate chips instead of a candy bar. Okay, so those kinds of things are options that you should consider. The biggest target that I want to eliminate is when people have impulsive cravings. They don't realize they're after the carbs or the salt, but they'll resort to things like chips. And potato chips are one of the worst sources of snacks you can ever consider. High in carbohydrate, high in fat. Basically, 10 calories per chip if you do the math looking at the side of a bag. And I found it very helpful in counseling patients that if you must have something like potato chips, eat them one at a time. And each time you pick up a chip, go 10, 20, 30, and it'll be a lot easier to just have one bag. But anyway, the idea is there are healthier alternatives like fruits, and we'll get into that a little more in a minute. Now, the other concept I want to hasten to interject here is the artificial sweeteners have been used as a source of ways to deal with sugar cravings. That's the worst advice you could possibly get. Using a lot of artificial sweeteners basically guarantees that you will be obese. These products, the sucralose and the others, aspartame, etc., all these products trick the brain into thinking you're consuming sugar. And you get an insulin response that's not unlike when you consume sugar. Therefore, insulin does what insulin does. It drives all the calories intracellularly, and then all of a sudden you're hungry again. And there's good hard science that I can share with you if you drop me a note at info@wisemedicalcenter.com. But there's good science to show that using artificial sweeteners practically guarantees that you will remain obese. So I discourage that option, even though several of the references that I came up with for ways to deal with sugar cravings, they mention artificial sweeteners. Now, one point that I do think is important is, and this came from a column in one of the diabetes articles, journals rather. One of the diabetes articles had an article by Michael Dempsey that refers to simple drinking a glass of water. And this is based on the notion that it's difficult sometimes emotionally or psychologically to determine whether we're thirsty or if we're hungry. So when you think you're hungry, it's very helpful if before you imbibe a whole bunch of unnecessary calories, just drink a tall glass of water and wait a few minutes. A lot of times, if it's really thirst that you're dealing with as opposed to hunger cravings, that can get you past consuming a whole bunch of carbs that you don't need. Now, we mentioned fruit earlier, and that concept was to mention combining sources of calories for sake of good nutrition, especially for people who are not restricting their calories. But when you just have to have something sweet, one option is something on the order of a few, and I don't mean cups full, but a few berries, and it doesn't matter which berry, but berries are pretty low in calories, and you end up with something in the neighborhood of 10 to 20 calories, which is only, a gram or two of sugar. And sometimes just that little consumption might be enough to satisfy a craving and keep you from doing something more impulsive that would be worse for your diet. Now, we mentioned earlier how carbohydrates, sugar in particular, increases the endorphins and the various neurotransmitters that make us feel good, serotonin not the least of which. But you can also increase endorphins with a brisk walk. So if you have a craving for sugar, this works for cravings for other substances as well. We've talked about this in the context of our addiction treatments. But a brisk walk, or more brisk forms of exercise, cardio if you will, can help with cravings of multiple natures, and it doesn't take very long. A 10-minute walk, down the road, turn around and come back, you've got 20 minutes of exercise in it before you realize it, and a lot of those cravings can just go away without a whole bunch of calories. Now, a different reference came up with a suggestion for dealing with sugar cravings by taking a stick of sugar-free gum. Now that gets back to my artificial sweetener argument. I'm not a fan of the artificial sweeteners, but the thought behind the sugar-free gum that does make sense is the minty flavor, the peppermint, which you can get from other sources without having to have a bunch of calories. But the easiest one that won't hurt your regimen, that may satisfy the cravings, would be a simple mouthwash. using a mouthwash that has some minty flavor may be a good way, because you're going to spit out the mouthwash, you're not going to consume it. But also that minty flavor contrasts, or conflicts, I should say, with other things you might want to eat. Pastry just doesn't taste as good when you just wash your mouth out with a minty form of mouthwash. Now, last but not least, in terms of how to deal with sugar cravings, I wanted to say there comes a time when you need to eat. So rather than having a snack, it may be appropriate to adjust the timing of your meals. Sometimes you need to eat when it's time to eat if you're hungry. And when you're not hungry, don't eat. So don't eat just because it's a certain time of day. Eat when you're hungry, and make sure you have structured meals planned so that you are able to have intervals between meals that allow you not to have to deal with so many cravings. Now, I really will purposely avoid, because I'm still studying, the notion of these interval fasts, okay? Fasting has become, for periods of 6 hours, 12 hours or more per day, has become a mechanism by which people are reducing their total calories and successfully losing weight. The data is clear that people are able to lose weight doing it this way, but I'm not yet sure what all the physiologic consequences are, and I don't know how realistic it is to sustain a regimen that's based on fasting. So stay tuned. I'm going to come up with better references, better data, and I'll do a video in that regard about the interval fasting in the future, because I do believe there's something there. Last but not least, this is the third last but not least, I believe. Sometimes it's a matter of anxiety and stress that drives us to eat. And when appropriate, it has to be addressed sometimes with something other than food. Counseling, behavioral therapists do a wonderful job of helping us to deal with emotional stress that might otherwise be dealt with by eating. Or sometimes prescription medications for anxiety are less dangerous than a honey bun. So you really have to consider medical intervention and or psychiatric counseling on occasion when you're thinking about ways to deal with stress, rather than putting all of your problems in a binge of either something like pastries or worse, alcohol. So for now, I'm going to end there with this talk about sugar cravings. But if you have further suggestions, or if you have questions about this or any other topic, please email me at info@wisemedicalcenter.com, and we'll bring more information of this nature after I've had a chance to research it to your attention.
Thank you for listening to the Wise Medical Minute with Dr. Thomas Locke. Dr. Locke addresses current events as well as important medical issues using responsible, unbiased journalism approached from a medical perspective. We invite you to submit questions or comments or suggestions for future topics by email to info@wisemedicalcenter.com. Again, thank you for viewing the Wise Medical Minute.